now that I know my ride height, my rake, the front, the rear, all the dimensions from the ground, I need to mock up the rear end and get an idea of how that matches up with all those dimensions. The rear of this frame, I want to be 17 inches off the ground. Well, now that I've got everything mocked up, I just slid this rear end into place. This spring system and this spring system was the original Jeepster. This bottom spring, you can see the distance here. It's probably 8 inches. This top spring was the overload spring that the clowns used back in the day when the Jeepster was being used in parades. It's kind of hard to imagine, but this spring was actually compressed all the way up to the point where this overload spring was hitting the frame when it was just sitting empty. I mean, you load it with fuel and put 4 people in it, and this would be sitting on the frame pretty hard. So that just goes to show how much these springs have relaxed over the years and with all the load of everything they were doing with it in the past. So with that in mind, putting this in and having it rest on the axle, it is raising the rear of this frame up about 2 inches, maybe 3. It's hard to know just exactly how much from all the weight, but I'd say, let's just say 3 inches. So if I put a 2-inch lowering block on this spring, and I am going with 1 inch or overall 2 inches smaller tire, so that's going to drop the axle 1 inch, 2-inch block, I'm good. But that still brings up the point that this spring is weakened that much over the years. And one of the things I found out as I started shopping for leaf springs, I thought, well, no big deal. I'll replace the leaf springs. Well, these leaf springs are only 2 inches wide. Most leaf springs are 2.5 to 3 inches wide. So I was looking at replacing these. They're about $250 each on each side. But since they're only 2 inches wide, if I put lowering blocks, all the lowering blocks are 2.5, 3 inches wide. So let's say I found a 2.5 inch wide lowering block. They're not sitting perfectly on there. The lowering blocks are hollow. And the stability then of these narrower springs, the rear end isn't going to stay put. And I'm going to put wider wheels. I want to go with about a 9 to 10 inch wide tire. These wheels are, I think, 5 inches, 4.5, 5 inches. The wheel is going to be 8. I need to be able to clear everything, and it's tight. It's going to be really tight. So if I get any movement in this rear end, then I'm going to be hitting the frame or hitting the wheel wells. And yes, I can put a panhard bar, I can stabilize that all out, but it's just not ideal. And the amount of money that I'm going to be spending on inferior parts, I can change all of this to a 4-link system. And the 4-link systems are just amazing. The one I'm looking at is a triangulated 4-leaf. So 2 leaves on the bottom that ties into the frame that are straight, and then your triangulated comes off of the pumpkin, so that keeps it from moving. And then another thing, the shocks for the Willys is just a stud. They're not threaded, and it just has a cotter pin. Well, when I bought this, when we were loading it on the trailer, one of the rear shocks popped off. It just sheared off that cotter pin. So it's not a very good system. Well, keep in mind, This Jeepster, when it was designed in the mid-1940s, right after World War II, the top speed on this thing was 55 miles an hour. So they didn't have to really think too much about all of these components like I am. Now if I want to go 100 miles an hour with 400 horsepower, it just isn't going to cut it. So as you can see, I have a different rear end in here, or maybe you wouldn't know. If you're a Willys guy, you would know. Or if you're a Ford Mustang guy, you would know. This is the rear end out of the Mustang. It's a 66 Mustang. It's not the 9-inch. It's not quite as ideal as having a heavy-duty 9-inch rear end. But me, not knowing a whole lot about Ford, I'm not a Ford guy, as I've mentioned in the past. I didn't realize what I was buying. It pays to really research, but I got such a good deal on it, I figured, how can I really go too much wrong on it? I mean, after all, this was all Mustang at one time. Well, with 400 horsepower, I don't know if you can hear it or see it. See all that movement? The tires aren't moving. What the guy told me, he spent almost $1,000 rebuilding all of this for his Mustang with his new 400 horsepower motor and his 4-speed transmission. He upgraded to disc brakes on the back. He spent $600 just on the disc brakes alone. And then doing a burnout. He said something popped. It made a lot of noise. It really makes noise going down the road. So something inside broke. Well, now that I own it and doing my research, I'm finding out it's a common problem with these when you start pushing that much horsepower. I paid $700 for the whole thing, thinking, well, if the brake system was $600, and I've been pricing them, they go for $550, $600. I roughly paid $100 for this rear end if I was to take all those components off and put it on a different rear end. So it's worth it to me to look into this and see if I can make it work. I could beef this up. There are things in it that are a little bit weak, even if I beef this up. But for this car, 2,500 pounds, a convertible Phaeton, I'm not going to be drag racing it. I'm not going to be running it through any high-speed obstacle courses or anything. This is just a fun driver. So I think this rear end will be fine. It will fit well with all of this. But that's the beauty of hot rodding. You get crazy and you start breaking things, and well, it's just another day in the shop and in the garage, and you upgrade it. I paid so very little for this thing. It's worth giving it a shot. In my research, I wanted to make sure this rear end that I was going to upgrade to, that was fairly inexpensive, would fit in the Willys Jeepster frame and stance and everything that way. And I was surprised that the 66 Mustang, this rear end fits perfectly underneath this Willys. Now if it was a 69 Mustang, 67 Mustangs, they went a little bit wider and a little bit wider as they went newer. But it just so happens that the 66, I don't have to trim this rear end down. Now if I wanted to go with a Ford 9-inch, go with a heavier rear end, a Curry or something like that, I would have to have one custom made. And you're looking at about $1,500 to get it made to fit with the axles. So this is just perfect. I mean, with these original tires, it is snug. I mean, there's only maybe an inch and a half to spare on each side. Now when I go with wider wheels, they have further offsets, so it shoves them out. But the nice thing about this width is let's say I do get a wider wheel and the offset isn't quite enough and it rubs on the frame, rather than cutting the frame, making changes that way, which I had to do on another car, I could just put in spacers and I can push those wheels out a little bit. So this appears to me to be a really good fit. So I'm going to stick with it. So now I need to take this out and see what's broke. I don't see any obvious signs that any oil is leaked out anywhere, but the amount of gear oil that drained out of that was only about a cup. I know they take more than that. Probably easiest to let it hang down and just fall out, but I want to control it a little bit. Okay, well that's one way to do it. I used the tag that was hanging on one of the bolts, but before I used that tag to go in and do my research, I wanted to see if this had maybe been tampered with before. Maybe things have been apart. It doesn't look like this has ever been apart. And I know enough about backlash and how this should all fit together. And the gear, the ring gear, and the pinion gear, they seem to be perfectly aligned and adjusted. Just visually and filling that gap, it feels really good. I was expecting something to be really wrong in here, but because it was loose all the way around, that leads me to believe that maybe there's a spider gear that's damaged, or maybe the pin is sheared and everything is working, but it's just really loosened things up inside of there. So after everything that I'm seeing here, visually everything looks good. There was not very much gear lube in there. It was definitely low. Very sludgy, very thick. A lot of sludge in the bottom. So yeah, I don't think this has been apart before. And since that tag was still on there, I was able to do a little bit of research, and the numbers on this match what should have been in here for a 66 Mustang. And the codes on here, 66 Mustang V8. The 2.80 is the gear ratio. So yeah, this has a 2.8 to 1 gear ratio, which is okay, especially for freeway driving if you want to get up into traffic and hold traffic and keep your RPMs down. But with the size of tires that I want to do on this, the type of driving I want to do, I want to go with something more in the 3.5 to 1 gear ratio. If I was to put an overdrive in this, I would even punch it up closer to, say, a 370 to a 400 even. But with it being a Jeepster convertible Phaeton, I don't need to go real fast. This doesn't even have windows. And if you do get windows, they're plastic windows. So at 80 miles an hour, this thing is just going to be as you're driving. So for a fun weekend cruiser, take it to car shows, run around town, take my wife out to dinner, it doesn't need to go 120 miles an hour. The guy that I got the motor and transmission from, he gave me an extra one of these. So I could just buy new gears and use the other center section and probably be good, but it's crazy. Once I have all this apart, I may as well spend the extra money and put in a posi. I've been cutting and grinding and welding, and I came up with a piece that the channel pieces that I had for a cross member. Looks great. I've got the height where I want it. I got the angle where I want it. It's sitting sturdy on this cross member, so I'm excited about that piece. So now that I've got everything aligned, I feel comfortable now about cutting this top hat out. Once I get this cut out, these three are still all welded together, as well as all four are welded together on the bottom. So the strength in this whole frame system is phenomenal. Once I cut this one off, it's still going to be really strong, but just to tie it together, I don't want anything vibrating, I don't want any chance of anything moving, even though it's not very likely. I'm going to go ahead and weld a plate across here, and that will tie everything back together. So once I get this cut out, then I can keep trimming and grinding until I get all my linkage for the stick shift to work. This linkage on the transmission just really caused a lot of havoc. Everything else just tucked in there real nice. So what started out as just being a nice U-shaped cut for the shifter, I ended up having to cut all of this area off to clear this shift linkage. Everything else was tucked in there nice, but this piece, it just encroached on all of this area. So I ended up cutting all of this top piece off. I really don't think it's compromised any of the structural integrity with these other three all coming together when welded top and bottom. So I'm just going to take and put in a channel right here that will stiffen all this piece back up. That area is pretty much done now. Well, I'm just waiting to get my 4-link triangulated linkage to put all this back together.